it's almost like a kind of an obsession that we have, that we think that by deconstruction, we're going to come to a greater understanding of things. And frankly, all of the evidence suggests quite the opposite.
Welcome to the Daron Earlewine podcast, where we awaken you to become who you were born to be. Here's your host, Daron Earlewine.
Hey, welcome back to the Daron Earlewine podcast. So stoked to have you back, and got a doozy of an interview today. So stoked to have Mike Breen in the house today for our interview. If you've never heard of Mike Breen, you're getting ready to. He is an author, pastor, speaker, has really changed my life over the past decade. He had a ministry called 3DM. He still leads that they have overseen a discipleship making movement throughout the U.S. and it impacted my life just over a decade ago, and just drastically changed the way I do my whole life and understand my purpose in general. And a term that we're going to use on today's podcast is my macro purpose. And I think it's going to impact you in big ways today, and I can't wait to get into that. Before we get there, I want to say thank you for all the new people that have joined us here on the podcast. We've been averaging about 100 new people a week, which if you're a huge, big-time, podcast, and you're getting 8,000 downloads a week, then you're like, oh, small potatoes. But for us, it's super, super meaningful. And so I want to thank the 100 people that have joined us this week or the past week. Those of you that are new to the Daron Earlewine community in the podcast, it means a ton for you guys to be here, and I hope you're enjoying listening to the podcast as much as I enjoy putting it together. And I've been asking you guys to reach out, whether it's through text message, and that number is 317-550-5070. You can text me directly or email me at darren@blackbirdmission.com. And the responses are starting to come through. I want to thank you guys for reaching out. And I tell you what, a couple weeks ago, I guess it would be, we released an episode with Heather Simple, and this episode blew up. And the feedback we're getting has been huge. I want to thank Kyle, a listener, because he's a podcast newbie. And he said he's been following our ministry at a distance for quite some years, and about 10 years ago. And then he started getting some of our emails we've been sending out. If you want to get on our email list, you can do that by just emailing me, or you can also do it by going to blackbirdmission.com or to DaronEarlewine.com, and you can get our weekly email. But anyway, Kyle's been getting the emails, so he decided to check out the podcast. And he said when Heather hit the quote and she said, "Who were you before someone told you who you weren't?" He said it was absolutely a mic drop moment for him. And we got that same sentiment from tons of people that reached out to us after that podcast episode went out with Heather Simple. If you haven't had a chance to go back and listen to that episode, it is worth the listen. I want to thank Heather so much for being on the podcast and for her vulnerability and her story. It was great stuff. So would love to hear from you. Still reach out to us. We would love to hear how the podcast is impacting you. Maybe some stuff you'd like to hear us talk about. Guests. Maybe if there's a guest who would say, you know what, I would love for you guys to interview fill in the blank. Let us know that, and we'll chase that person down, see if we can't get them on the podcast. And we would really appreciate that. The other thing is, if you know somebody who's a podcaster and maybe they're looking for guests and you think some of my content would be helpful to their audience, reach out to us and maybe connect the dots. We're always looking for an opportunity to connect with new friends and content creators all around the world. So we're talking about Mike Breen today. And here's the question I want to ask you is, what's the payoff for following Jesus? What's the payoff? And I think when we think of that, we may not say it that way, but if we dig down below the surface a little bit, all of us at least started out with a reason that we decided to begin following Jesus. And it was a thought of that if I do this, I'm going to get this out of it. And so that's what I mean by the payoff. So what is the main payoff for following Jesus? And Mike's going to take us through a journey today to help us get our mind around that. And I think you're going to enjoy it. And I think some of the main ones, right, that you may identify with, you say, you know what, a lot of people start following Jesus because they don't want to go to hell. And that's the way it's presented. Like, listen, if you don't know Jesus, you go to hell. And they're like, well, I don't want to go to hell, so I guess I better follow Jesus. And so the payoff there is just not go to hell, which I don't want to go to hell either. I'm glad I follow Jesus, so I'm not going to. But here's the deal. That is most of the time in our brain, something that we foresee that is going to happen way down the path of life. I could die today. I hope I don't, please, Lord Jesus. But in my brain, I think I'm probably going to die somewhere in my 90s, maybe. Okay. And so the thought of I follow Jesus so I don't go to hell, but it might not happen until I'm 90, then I'm not left with a lot of understanding of the purpose or how it makes any difference today because I didn't get into it. I didn't enter the relationship for what I can do and walk with Jesus today. I got into it for what he could do for me forever. That's a modern day today disconnect that keeps me from living in the purposes that God has for me. Some of us, right, we follow God because if I do, God will do what I want. And so some people can call this kind of like your cosmic butler or your genie in a bottle kind of thing. Like I started following Jesus because somebody told me that if I pray and he'll give me anything I want. And that works sometimes. And then until God's will doesn't match up with what you want in that moment and it doesn't work out. And then you resent God and hate him because he didn't give you what you wanted on your Christmas list for that year. Not a great plan for the reasons to follow Jesus. Another one that would probably characterize some people is your payoff for following Jesus. I'm following Jesus because I don't want anything bad to happen in my life. And so I believe that if I follow Jesus, nothing bad ever happens until something bad happens because we live in a fallen world and Jesus didn't actually guarantee us that us following him would guarantee a problem-free life. In fact, just the opposite. Jesus said things like, hey, in this world, you're going to have troubles of many kind. But then he said, but hey, take heart, have good courage because I've overcome the world. I can bring peace and hope in the midst of the struggle. So if any of those characterize one of the reasons that you got into following Jesus, I want to try to reframe what the payoff actually is today. And Mike is going to unpack it in a beautiful way because I don't want you to follow on false pretense and I don't want you to be disappointed because the greatest thing you could ever do is be in a relationship following Jesus. And I want you to do it for the right reasons so that you can experience the peace and the passion and the purpose that come with it. So Mike's going to talk about what we'll talk about 3 payoffs that I think are correct and helpful, and they're presence, peace, and purpose. Mike's going to talk about right off the bat about his connection to coming to God. He grew up, wasn't a Christian growing up. At 16, he comes to faith. He reads the whole Bible, which was kind of a crazy thing for him because he grew up dyslexic. Struggled to read, very brilliant, but couldn't translate it in tests in school because he was dyslexic. So it's kind of a crazy thing for him to become a great speaker and author over 20 books when he starts off his path in life and he's dyslexic and feels like maybe he couldn't excel. He couldn't actually be as smart or as accomplished as much as other people. And one of the things that Mike's going to talk about here is this idea of the process of producing results in our life through indirect effort. And the foundation for Mike in that is that he grew up without a lot of teachers or mentors in his life except for Jesus and the Bible. And so he spent a lot of time in the presence of God through the written word and the living word of God, and felt like that Jesus taught and instructed him so much in those early years, and that formed really the foundation for the discipleship movement he started, which is characterized by 2 questions. What's God saying to me, and what am I going to do about it? That's what I teach as I take people through discipleship huddles. I huddle 8 guys a year in a discipleship huddle. I've been doing that now for 6 years, and a lot of that, almost all of that, comes back to the moments that Mike came into my life. And one thing he basically explains in there is that the payoff of following Jesus isn't the significant things we can accomplish, but it's actually being in the presence of Jesus, which seems super basic, but it's huge. And it's a guarantee of us actually producing the kind of fruit that God has put a desire in our heart to produce. So it's this weird thought of like, I want to maybe, and I talk a lot about purpose here on the podcast. That's what this is all about. And so you may think, man, I want to accomplish great things and discover my purpose. And so I focus all of my time on that. But what Mike brings us back to is that the principle of indirect effort, what Jesus says is that it's actually him that produces the significant fruit in our life. And so the only thing that we actually have really control over is how much time we spend abiding in him. The scripture that Mike alludes to here that you listen to comes from John chapter 15, where Jesus says it like this: I am a true sprouting vine, and the farmer who tends the vine is my Father. He cares for the branches connected to me by lifting and propping up the fruitless branches and pruning every fruitful branch to yield an even greater harvest. The words I've spoken over you already have cleansed you, so you must remain in life union with me, for I remain in life union with you. For as a branch severed from the vine will bear no fruit, so your life will be fruitless unless you live your life intimately joined to mine. I know you want to produce fruit in your life. You want to accomplish things. You want to have a sense of significance in your life. God has created you for that. And you wouldn't be listening to a Purpose podcast if that's not one of the payoffs that you wanted in following Jesus. If you're listening to this podcast, you're not walking through your life going, I follow Jesus because I would like to be useless and never accomplish anything in my life. That's not you, okay? It's not. You want to accomplish something. You want to make a difference. You want your life to matter. We all do. But I love what Mike brings us back to is if our obsession is in the results we're going to produce, we're on our own. And what Jesus says, listen, I'm going to take care of the results, but what you can control is this payoff of being in my presence, being connected to me. The next thing that Mike's going to talk about, and I want you to hear this, is the payoff of peace. Mike's going to talk about the fact that when he left his church in England, in Sheffield, England, it was the largest church in England. He had done it. He had accomplished it. He had done big things. And what he could have done is stayed there, made the salary he was making, had all the notoriety and all of the fame that was coming from that, and just kind of milked that for the rest of his life. He could have written his books. He could have done a lot of things, but been the pastor there in Sheffield, England. People could come and they would have conferences and everybody would think that Mike Breen was so great and he could show off his accomplishments. But what does he do? He resigns and he leaves the country. He goes all the way across the pond to America to start this ministry of 3DM, to replicate some of the discipleship models that they had there. And I don't know if you've ever had a great accomplishment in your life or spent years building something, but to walk away from that which you've built, a vision that you felt like you had from God, is unbelievably difficult. And Mike's going to talk about he was able to do that. And then he briefly talks about the fact that a couple of years ago, he walked away from leading 3DM the way they were leading it to what he's doing now. And when I ask him what allowed him to have the courage to make those big moves, he says it was the peace of God. He'll talk in there about Colossians 3, where it says this, let the peace of Christ rule in your hearts, since as members of one body, you are called to peace and be thankful. I love the way the Passion Translation says it. Let your heart be always guided by the peace of the Anointed One, who called you to peace as a part of his one body. Mike's going to unpack a way that word peace is used and what it means. You're going to really love this. But here's the thing I want to pull out for you here and see. As I've said this before, if you want to listen to the voice of God, you want to know what is God saying to me. All you got to do is read the Bible out loud, and you're going to know this is the voice of God. This is what God's saying. Listen to what God is saying is true about you here. Okay, He's saying that you are called to peace as members of one body, right? Let the peace of Christ rule in your hearts because you were called to peace. If you want to know what your calling is, don't listen to your podcast because you keep saying, God created us on purpose and for a purpose, and I want to live a life worthy of the calling that God's placed in my life. Here's what it is. God has called you to peace. And that doesn't mean like that you're just there to be a peacemaker and all your relationships are good. I'm talking about the deep inner peace that you know that you're doing the right thing, even if it doesn't make sense to anyone else. And so if you're at a place where maybe God's calling you in his presence to walk away from some great accomplishment, something that you've built, maybe it's a relationship, maybe it's a business, maybe it's a church, I don't know what it could be. You're called to live in peace. And so pursue that sense of peace. And guess where it proceeds from? The presence of God. Mike's going to unpack that. I think you're going to really enjoy it. I want to get right to the interview. You're tired of hearing my voice. Mike speaks with a great British accent. You're going to dig it. Everything he says is going to sound smarter than what I say. It is, and he's actually going to sound even better because of that. So let's jump into the interview. When we come back, I'm going to hit you with the third payoff for why we follow Jesus. And I think it's worth the wait. You'll have to figure it out. Enjoy this conversation with Mike Breen. And when we come back, I'll hit you with the last and final payoff right here on the Daron Earlewine podcast. Hey, I'm excited to sit down today. I guess sit down. I'm standing. He's sitting. We're on virtual land with Mike Breen, and Mike has impacted my life in massive ways over the past decade. And I'm so excited to have him on the podcast today. Mike's an author. He's a pastor. He's from England, so his accent's going to be amazing to listen to, and everything he says will sound way smarter than what I say. But Mike started a church, a replant in England that grew, quickly became one of the largest churches in England. Later on, he launched 3DM, which is a disciple-making movement that has been global, and that's where I connected with Mike. He's authored multiple books, Family on Mission, Building a Discipleship Culture, and his newest book, The Seven Churches, is just out. We'll get to that, but Mike, I can't say thanks enough for being on the podcast, and just welcome.
Thank you. It's an absolute pleasure, Daron. And what a great way to reconnect. It's
Exactly.
great. This kind of post-pandemic world, we're all reconnecting, and I love it. I just think it's marvelous.
Well, thank you so much, and I can't wait to get into the story. Mike, the little bit of the context I want to give the folks is my first time really meeting you, and this was the watershed moment that changed my life. As I remember, we were at a church, a learning community kind of a taster or something like that. I believe we were in Lexington, Kentucky, or Cincinnati. I can't remember which. I think it was Lexington, and you got up with there was about 200 church leaders in the room. And you asked us what the Great Commission was, and we all, recited the Great Commission like good pastors do. And then you asked us a tough question. You said, if I went to your church right now, do you think I could walk around on a Sunday morning and find anyone that would say that they know they're being personally discipled by you? And I think there were two guys in the front row that got real brave and raised their hand and said yes. And so there was 198 that couldn't raise their hand. And two that did. And then you said, okay, guys, remind me again what the Great Commission is. And obviously it's to make disciples. And in that moment, that changed the trajectory of my life in a major way over the past decade, Mike, because it helped me get to terms with the fact that so often we're forgetting our roots of what it actually means to follow Jesus and make disciples. And so what I want to jump into today is, for one, just to say thank you for the way that impacted and shaped my ministry, my life. But I want to be able to just seed our conversation in your journey to get to the place where God brought you to that kind of epiphany and that kind of understanding in your leadership. And so if we were to go back and find Mike Breen as a 8-year-old in England and tell him that he was going to do what you're doing right now, was that in the cards for you as a 8-10-year-old kid in England?
No, absolutely not. As an 8 and 10-year-old kid, I couldn't read. I was, they didn't really know what dyslexia was back when I was a kid, but I was dyslexic. It meant that I was deeply frustrated at school. Whenever they did intelligence tests, I was one of the smartest kids. Whenever I did an examination, I was bottom of the class. And so it was a deeply stressful time for a little kid like me. And it wasn't really until I was about 15 that the thing that happens in some dyslexics' brains, which is that they kind of get reorganized and they develop some kind of compensating neural network, that I suddenly made these leaps forward. And it was around that time, funnily enough, that I encountered the Bible for the first time. I'd never read a book from cover to cover. I decided that this was a book that was worthy of that. And it was an American teacher in England who gave it to me. And it really was just by reading that I came to know the Lord. So it's been an amazing journey for me, because I came out of just a happy pagan English background, the average British background, which is, there's some reference to God in some way or another, but there's no Christianity. And then suddenly, through reading the Bible, the Lord spoke to me personally, directly. I assumed that God would still do the things that he did in the Bible, like speak to people directly, and I found that he did. And that really was the beginning of an amazing journey.
So how old were you when that happened, Mike?
I was 16 when I read the Bible. I was just turning 16. So 16, it was a summer vacation, and I just kind of dived into it.
Did you have any peers, or was there any mentors or people around you would say that helped you understand, like, hey, God can speak to you? And once that started happening, like, what was that mentorship, or who did you kind of follow in that process?
There was nobody. And the American teacher was there because her husband was doing something in the University of Manchester, she disappeared. So I came back after the summer break and she'd gone. And there were no Christians that helped me read the Bible. The Bible itself had a little reading plan in it. It was one of the first modern translations. It was the Living Bible. It had a little reading plan in the back, so I just followed that. And it was very clear to me that God was speaking to me directly. And as I grew through those months, the thing that I did was just ask one of the teachers who I knew was a Christian, where did he go to church? And so I just went to his church. and I was in seminary in 2 years. So I was 16. I went to seminary at 18. Can you imagine?
Wow.
And that was a pretty speedy launch for a young guy.
So much of our roots do shape, our imagination and the way that we, engage in a relationship, with Jesus. And I just wonder, do you feel like maybe some of it, the fact that you did discover basically the Holy Spirit in the Bible, laid a foundation for what you began to do in teaching people that you really can be discipled by Christ? I mean, if you'd come through a super structured, programmatic type of, mega church, experience, do you think you would have had the imagination to step into what you've done over the past 20 years?
I mean, I don't know. The reality is that the kind of meme of the discipling movement these days, what is God saying to you and what are you going to do about it, is basically my testimony. So that testimony of God speaking to me in my heart as I'm reading the scriptures, and then me asking myself the question, so what am I going to do about that? That literally is my testimony that has now become mimetic in the sense that I've shared it with who knows how many hundreds of thousands of people. And, that little meme, like all good memes, is no longer associated with me. It just goes off now and it's doing its own thing. It's got its own ministry.
Which is beautiful.
It is beautiful, yeah.
Mike, one question I have, I guess, is, and this is more about application of this principle than it is, you stepping into your sense of calling. So I don't want to get out of order, but I think it's intriguing that when I came in contact with you 10 years ago, like I knew, like I said, I knew what the Great Commission was, and I had been in, pastoring for 10 years at that point. But it's just the application of like, yes, we actually go and gather people and make disciples was just not something that we were necessarily doing. We were obviously we were trying to do that, but why do you think it's still a situation where either churches don't, or specifically why we as disciples of Jesus see that as impossible, or see that as something that only the really mature people do? Why do we so still lack an imagination to actually do the exact thing Jesus told us to do as far as making disciples?
I mean, it's a huge question, Daron, but I would say some of the fundamental reasons are that we have been more influenced by the Enlightenment than we would ever imagine. I mean, America is a post-Enlightenment experiment. And because of that, all of the elements of Enlightenment thinking are in the fabric of how we operate. And so we genuinely believe that the basis of discipleship is information and the acquisition of information, and then the communication and transmission of information. And of course, information is one element, but we're pre-Enlightenment with Jesus because it's information and then imitation. And so without the imitation component, you cannot possibly either become a disciple or create a disciple, because that's the way that it happened in the original, if you like, the original code. So if that's the way that Jesus designed it, that there was a prerequisite of imitation built into the original package, obviously we're always going to be bumping our heads against a brick wall if we're just focusing on information. Yeah. And I'm afraid you see it all the time.
So if that's the case, you went to seminary as an 18-year-old, then before you know it, you're pastoring a church, you're following, I'm guessing, some of the same structures that people had, and you're seeing this grow, you're seeing it begin to explode. How did you, from that point, if there is that part of imitation, who were you imitating at that point to say, you know what, this is the way we're going to grow this church, this is the way we're going to make disciples?
Well, that's always a problem for all Christian leaders. Who do you find to imitate? But what I did is I tried to find people who I could either emulate from a distance or imitate kind of in close proximity by saying, that person over there is really good at ... So they may be really good at praying, or they may be really good at preaching, or they may be really good at the pastoral care that makes another person feel the presence of Jesus. So what I did is I assumed, just because it was a natural assumption of mine, I assumed that Jesus wanted to continue to disciple me, and that all of the resources of discipleship were around me, that he was working in the people around me, and he was offering me imitatable patterns in the people around me. So in many ways, I had to construct this thing pretty much from the ground up myself, because there's nobody else around that was really doing that. And then on the basis of that, I was able to share that as a pattern. So it's never been a program for me, but it is a pattern of life. And of course, I guess because it's a pattern of life, and because it's something that I've had to kind of cobble together from the elements that I could see in the scriptures and the people that I could encounter in my life, it's got a sense of immediacy about it.
I know the way you guys were doing church in England at that time. It's still not normative in America, but I'm guessing it was very not normative at that time in England.
Yeah. We've had to take on a lot of challenges, and the challenges have been the kinds of challenges that you could associate with those that, say, Jesus or Paul had to deal with from the religious elite. The religious elite really don't like movement because they can't control it. And so institutional Christianity generally struggles with the kinds of things that we're talking about.
As you guys grew the church, Mike, you got to a place where you took a huge risk, which was to step out of the local church ministry, and you had success, you had significance, you had probably all the things that a lot of people in your field would be like, man, this is when you've really arrived, right? This is the brass ring, you're doing it. How did you get to the place to say, you know what, this is not just what I want, there's more, and to take the risk to walk away from that, to leave, your home country, to come to America? Take us through into that story, because I think so often people get caught up in thinking that success is the ultimate thing I'm looking for. And they can obviously, I think, sometimes be almost intoxicated, right, by the success of it, and get confused and lose where God is really leading them. And especially, I think, if they're in the younger side of their leadership journey and as they're walking with the Lord. Take us through that. How did you get to the point where you were able to walk away from that and step into that next journey with God?
Well, of course, if you immerse yourself in the text of Scripture, and particularly in the arc of the narrative of Jesus with his disciples, then there's a beginning and an end. It's not something that just continues ad infinitum. And the beginning is the invitation to discipleship, and the conclusion is the challenge to go and multiply the discipleship. And so I began to hear the Lord very much within that sense of the narrative of our lives saying to me, well, you've raised up the next generation of leaders. When are you going to give them the church? And of course, that's I think an entirely legitimate question for Jesus to ask somebody. because it's not my church. And so that was the question that I wrestled with, that my wife wrestled with. And over a period of about a year, we came to the conclusion that Jesus was definitely saying that for us to live an authentic life of discipleship, we had to give away the ministry that we had grown and developed to the disciples that we'd made. And we've actually done this on a few occasions, most recently with the 3DM movement, where it seemed absolutely certain that what we needed to do was to decentralize from a base where people had just become experts. We needed to decentralize and send out this movement so that it could be located in all of the different continents and all of the different cities and churches. And I guess the 3DM experience was even more painful than the experience of St. Thomas's in Sheffield, England, but all of it's painful. There's no simple way of saying that it's easy, because you've tried and you've told other people not to identify with the ministry. You tell yourself the ministry is not me, I'm not the ministry. But the fact is that you do get identified with it and you do get deeply invested in it. And it hurts to give it up and to risk it all in the hands of other people. And of course, you find yourself having to trust more in what it is that Jesus wants to do. I mean, the thing is this. It's not a question of whether I'm fruitful. It's a question of whether I believe Jesus is fruitful. Mm. And if Jesus is fruitful, I need to be connected to him. And so that means that the pattern of fruitfulness that Jesus describes, growing, bearing fruit, being pruned, and abiding, that kind of pattern of fruitfulness is something that needs to be mine on not only a daily basis, a weekly basis, a seasonal basis, a lifetime basis, because I believe that Jesus is inherently fruitful, and the way that his fruitfulness is expressed through me is by me abiding in him. See what I mean?
Mm-hmm. I do. I think one of the difficult things about that, though, Mike, is I think about, like, I don't know, as we grow, and I don't, I can see it in ministry circles, but I can see it in any, regular vocational pursuit. Is it's so difficult, I feel like, to not get sucked into this desire of, like, I've got to be successful. I need to do something, and especially in the ministries, sectors of, like, I've got to do something that's significant. Like, I want to be like Mike Breen. I want to grow this thing and make it big and whatever. And then you find yourself, envying what these people are doing and wanting to be over here. And I totally agree, is when we stay close to Jesus and he walks us into that, it's like, yes, it always works when we do it his way. But how do we not get caught up in that? Because I think about, the risk you took when you walked away, like I said, like the sense of significance and success that you had to sense, and probably people around you were envying you. Oh my gosh, I wish we could grow a church like Mike did. And maybe there's somebody listening now where it's not a church, but they've grown a business or whatever it is, and they're beginning to sense, like, this sense of success or significance isn't what I wanted it to be. But I guess how do we balance that and not allow that desire for success or significance or envy to come in and squash out the voice of God as we're walking into it?
Yeah, I mean, it's the big question. Obviously, they used to call it the $64,000 question before. That was the price of an average family suburban vehicle. Oh. But that question, I think, is the really, really essential question. And where it drives you is in the direction of all of spiritual growth down through the centuries. So if you were to ask the great men and women who are the giants of the faith down through the centuries, what is it that is an essential and foundational rule, then you would hear the idea of indirect effort. You see, we always assume that we're producing something by direct effort. So we're getting people to listen to us because we're good at speaking, and so we develop our capacity to speak. We think that we're multiplying the numbers of people in our ministry because we're cleverly learning how to assimilate people into that system. We're growing our business because of our capacity and our competence. Jesus said, a man goes out with seed and he plants it in his field, and night and day, he doesn't know how it grows, but all by itself, the seed grows. First the shoot, then the plant, then the full corn in the ear. All by itself. In other words, it's not us that's doing it. And so if it's not us that's doing it, and if you can come to the realization, the foundational, essential revelation that it really isn't us doing it, then you begin to focus on the one who is doing it. And that's the indirect effort. And so if fruit is the thing that we're called to, and the way that you get fruit is to abide in Christ, where are you going to focus? Are you going to focus on the fruit, or are you going to focus on Jesus? Well, Jesus says it's quite clear. Unless you abide in me, you cannot bear fruit. So we learn the lessons. To master the understanding of what it means to grow as a disciple means to master the understanding of the indirect effort.
I love it. But here's a question I have. Was there ever a point after you walked away from what was seen as success and significance, because you knew that's where Jesus was sending you, and you heard clearly, you knew that was the process? Was there ever moments where you had that, look back to Egypt moment or something, of like looking back and being like, oh my gosh, like, man, it was better then, or did I hear him wrong? Like, what's happening? I mean, were there still look back moments, even though you knew Jesus has told me to go this way, but were there moments where you looked back?
Oh, absolutely. Because none of this is done without cost.
Yeah.
And of course, the cost on some days feels higher than on other days. I mean, the sun's shining and everything's great in the world. It doesn't feel very costly. But then the bills come in and you can't pay them, and you're thinking, oh my goodness, what have I done? I've given up all of that source of income. Why the heck would I have done that? And then you start feeling sorry for yourself and all of that. So, of course, all of the same temptations at trial and trials that are common to everybody are common to you and I. But in the end, there is a payoff that is incredibly more valuable and significant than anything else. And that is this thing that Paul talks about in Colossians chapter 3:15, when he talks about, he uses this word in Greek, brabeno. It's the word for referee or arbitrator. And he says, let the peace of Christ brabeno in your heart. In other words, there's peace in your heart personified, obviously the Holy Spirit, personified holding a whistle, and he is giving you indication that you should just keep on playing or that you should stop. Having a sense of peace that governs and guides you, I mean, that's, ask people today whether they want peace in their heart in the midst of this, I mean, shockingly chaotic and anxious world that we're in.
Yeah.
1 in 4 millennials has considered suicide during this period. 1 in 4. 40% of the American populace has struggled with clinical depression over these last 8 months. I mean, we're talking about an epidemic of an entirely different kind that is predicated on just no peace in our hearts. And so I think the payoff of peace, governing and guarding us, and blowing that whistle when we need to stop, and encouraging us to keep playing the game when we need to do that, I think that's amazing. And why would you ever want to substitute that for something else?
I agree, Mike. Here, help me with this and help us with this. I feel like one of the things we talk about a lot here on the podcast is that we believe that God has made people on purpose and for a purpose. And I feel like that's absolutely true. And we want to help people. We take people through our spiritual DNA course and help them discover, their calling, and we take them through, Ephesians 4 to find out their voice in the kingdom. And I think it's so important, to help uncover purpose. But there are times that I feel like, and I want your opinion on this, that I'm not sure, do we focus too much on discovering individual purpose to the place where we sacrifice peace, or sometimes even place our individual purpose above what it really just means to follow Christ and be faithful in him? Talk about that, the sacrifice of purpose for peace, and if that makes sense, what I just said.
Yeah, I mean, that passage there in Colossians 3 talks about peace of Christ, not my peace, I can't generate it, the peace of Christ dwelling in me and the word of Christ dwelling in me. So what I'm saying and what I'm seeing there is that there is a greater reality that's bigger than me, and all of those passages are all talking collectively. They're using corporate language. So it's not just an individual reality. This is something that's shared amongst us. Yeah. This is something that is not defined by some clever, 5-year plan, 3-point success strategy. Right. This is not a purpose other than the purpose for which we were created. And so if you were to define the ways in which we have all been created for a purpose, then you'd say we've been created to worship God, we've been created to operate in community, and we've been created by God to be the conduit of his blessing to other people. Those three things are absolutely, without question, real for every single person.
Yeah.
You don't need a specific purpose beyond that. Of course, each day those things will be manifest in different ways. Of course, you'll begin to develop skills and expertise and giftings that mean that you have a way of channeling your worship and your community and your capacity to reach out. Of course, all of those things will happen, but it's much more important that we have the big picture that helps us define the little picture than the little picture that we're always attending to and then missing what the world is all about.
That's so good. You say things and I got to soak them in, but I got to ask the next question. I just want to watch the podcast back so I can hear you say stuff and then think about it and apply it. But that's the beauty of having it recorded. I can soak that in. But that's so huge, because I do feel like we lose the macro and what comes from it by focusing on the micro. And I think that's in any, that principle, I think about it even in a relationship, right? When I begin to focus on my needs above of serving and loving and being what I need to be as a husband or a dad or whatever it is, then I begin to deconstruct and hurt the very relationships that I'm in. And I think when we focus on the micro, whether it be our purpose or whatever it is, we lose it all.
Well, and again, it's that enlightenment model of the way that you understand things is to cut them down to smaller and smaller pieces. Who said? Of course, that's one journey, but there's another journey going in entirely the opposite direction. I can't understand a mountain range by finding out the chemical composition of the rocks. I've got to step back and look at the mountains and go, oh, okay, so that's what a mountain is. Of course, I can understand some of the things that make up the mountain by going the reductionist route, but honestly, I've got to go the other way. And of course, both of them are valid ways of expressing what it means to understand and perceive life, but I think that we're much, much more likely to kind of go into this reductionist, this kind of detailed. It's almost like a kind of an obsession that we have, that we think that by deconstruction, we're going to come to a greater understanding of things. And frankly, all of the evidence suggests quite the opposite.
So good. So good. Mike, let's talk about your new book, which I love the journey of the fact that you're, as a kid, you're dyslexic. You can't take tests in school. And then God says, hey, how about you author like 6 books or no, like 20 books, right? Which what about that? What if I go back to 10-year-old Mike and tell him that he's going to author 20 books? What does he say?
He says, I thought it was going to be 30. Yeah. I mean, I don't know. I mean, if you'd have told me then that I was going to read 30 books, then I would have said that's impossible, that nobody reads 30 books. How do you read 30 books? But, it's an interesting thing. Every book that I've ever written has either been me dictating it to a person that's writing it down and then me editing it, or from transcripts of my own teaching that then have been kind of formed into a manuscript that then I can then edit down. So I've spoken every single one of these books. And so every one of these books has been contained entirely inside my head and heart before it ever came out. And so it's an amazing thing for me to see how God does that. I mean, I don't know even what that is, but it's the way that he works with me. And it's, you talk about, that reference to Ephesians 2:10, where we've been created in Christ Jesus for good works. Well, I hope that the books are good works, but he's created me in a particular way that makes it possible for me to do that, which is kind of cool, I think.
Well, I love it, Mike, because for me, I have aspirations to write a book at some point, but I can speak usually really well. I'm gifted in that. But when I sit down to type, it's like a different part of my brain takes over, and it's not a good part of my brain. Like I'm like, how do you spell cat? Like it gets really bad. And it's so encouraging for me to hear you say, like, listen, like even stepping into the unique calling that God has for you and the impact that your books have made, like your writing has literally transformed my life and how I engage in mission and discipleship in my own life. But to know that for you, because of how God's created you, you speak those in, you do them in unique ways. And I think people need to hear that, because they may feel like because of these limitations or because I can't do it the traditional way, whatever that would be in whatever industry it may be, then God can't have that for me. But I love the fact that you've done it in a unique way to you, because it gives me an imagination and an encouragement to go, I don't have to be like everybody else. I just need to follow into what God's doing.
Absolutely. And I love that book recently produced by Malcolm Gladwell called David and Goliath. And he talks about all of these so-called weaknesses, these so-called David kind of identities that we think mean that we're definitely going to lose. And one of them is dyslexia. And he talks about dyslexia. And of course, all my kids are dyslexic because they tend to pick up on the father's line. And so I bought that book for all of them just as an encouragement. And they've all been incredibly successful, my kids. But instead of seeing these things, there are genuine disabilities that people have. But some things, like our mental landscape, they may actually be a feature of creation that is yet to be fully realized, kind of fully embraced in some of us. And I bet you, Daron, you could, if you just did a quick outline and you started to just say what you thought that outline was about, and then all of these when I started doing this, there were no transcription apps. But, you could transcribe it. You could write a book in a few months. Easy.
Well, you know what makes me think about that? I know this podcast is not about me just getting to talk to Mike Breen, although I'm really happy that it's happening. But, Mike, one thing that I think about in that moment is whenever I'm stepping into, and I know that God has that's one of my gifts to communicate. And is one thing that I notice in it is when I'm communicating just voice to voice or through my voice, I know that it's not me. I know that God is using me and equipping me and empowering me in those moments. What I feel like is when I try to type and I try to write is I'm trying to be something I'm not or seem smart or seem like I know where commas go in sentences and stuff like that, which I don't. But it's my own strength.
And there are so many people who are great at that. So why not just transcribe what you're saying and let somebody else do it? Just go ahead and do it.
Yeah. And when I would get done, I know I would feel like this was a gift from God, not something that I manufactured with my mind and my fingers, All right, I'm going to do it. That's okay. That's enough about me. Let's talk about
man. How about this? I'll write a preface for you. How about that?
Well, all right, Mike. We can't. I try not to cry on the podcast, but you can't say you're going to write a preface for my book that I'll speak in, because now all of a sudden we're in some kind of prophetic land of awesomeness.
So here's the new book, then, Daron.
Okay, let's talk about it.
Well, the back cover says this: John, the last of the 12 apostles, was isolated, alone, and in lockdown. The churches were unable to gather and under enormous pressure as they struggled to function in their households. Into this situation, Jesus, the glorious ascended Son of God, stepped into John's prison and walked among the churches, bringing hope, challenge, and guidance. Surely this is what we need today. So in other words, there is a time when the church was in lockdown and the leaders were in lockdown and there was massive levels of anxiety. And Jesus addresses the church in that situation. And we actually have it in the New Testament. Imagine that. So I felt like I needed to get this material. I taught it on a number of occasions. I was able to marshal that. I was able to transcribe that, do the thing that I'm talking about now, kind of get it into a text that worked. And I think it's turned out to be great, to be honest with you. So that's really the point of the book. The book is, what's it like to be the church in a time of crisis? That's the subtitle for the book. What's it like? And how does Jesus equip us to be that?
So necessary, because I feel like what we've seen so much in the past, since March, right, is that once so many people couldn't get together and do church as has always done it, they had no idea what to do or what that looked like.
Sure. And here's Jesus walking amongst the churches, not church buildings, but churches, people, and speaking to them, and talking to them, how he sees them, how he understands them, how he wants to grow them and develop them. It's amazing.
I love it, Mike. I can't wait to get into it. It's so appropriate for right now. And I feel like there's always those moments. I talk about this a lot, and I probably stole this from you, I'm not sure, but that we just get stuck to where we have such a deficit of imagination. It's not that we wouldn't follow Jesus. It's not that we don't want to. We just get to a place where we hit that ceiling of imagination. I've never seen it. I can't imagine it different than it is. And so we stop. And I'm excited to read the book, because I know it's going to be moments that's going to expand people's imagination to what it really means to follow Jesus in a time right now where maybe they've never seen it. They can't imagine what it looks like in this context.
Exactly. If you send me your address, I'll send it to you, Daron. How about that?
I'd love it. Mike, I can't say thanks enough. Such good content. It's a joy to talk with you, to see you again. And if I get talking this book in, I'll send you the rough draft, and you
I'd love that.
Make good on that preface, preface promise. We recorded it, so now I know him. I got to hold it.
Oh, I promise I'll do it. And thanks for bearing with me. This is the time of day when English people have afternoon tea. So I've been drinking my tea and I've been eating my cookie. We call those biscuits back home. And so I hope that's not distracted anybody, but I thought I may as well do the thing I normally do.
I like it. I love it. Mike, thank you. Can't wait to read the book, and we'll share some of the content with our audience. So it means the world. Appreciate it, brother.
Thank you, brother. It's great to see you.
And we're back. Oh, Mike's sitting there in his office, drinking tea and eating a cookie, which he called a biscuit, because that's what they call it in England. Are you kidding me? Right? A biscuit? He's having a biscuit and tea because it's biscuit and tea time in the afternoon. We don't have that in America. Like, I just wish I had something where I could say that. Like, if I was on a podcast with somebody, that if it was like 2 PM, I'd be like, hey, don't mind me. Here in American culture, this is the time we do this thing. Like, that is the time I usually drink coffee because I feel like taking a nap at some point. But I mean, we don't really have anything. In Mexico, right, they have afternoon siestas, which is great. Like, how did we miss out on cool afternoon stuff here in America, right? British, I have a tea and crumpets, or not a crumpets, whatever, biscuits, whatever. And it just it looks cultured, it looks so good. Like, of course you would have a glass of tea and some cookies at 2:00 in the afternoon. Why not? What are you, a crazy animal? No, you're just an American. You have no traditions like that. Like I said, or a siesta. We drink a bunch of caffeinated beverages. You're going out and drinking a Bang, right? Sorry, laugh track for that one. Have you heard of Bangs? They try to make them healthy. They're not healthy. You know what the Bang is? It's your heart exploding. You're going to die if you drink Bangs, okay? Don't do that. Don't be an American and drink Bang. Unless, Bang, you would like to sponsor the podcast, and then I would gladly just pound a Bang right here on the podcast platform. Anyway, enough about that. Let's get back to what we're talking about, not Mike Breen and biscuits. The purpose, the payoff of following Jesus, right? So it's his presence. Obviously, Mike was talking about that. It's the peace. But the last one I want to hit is that it is purpose. The payoff of following Jesus is living a life of purpose. And I was stopped in my tracks when Mike started talking about the macro purposes of humanity. This is huge. And I want to come back here because I honestly felt guilty when I'm interviewing Mike. I don't know if you notice some of my pauses in my questions to him because I'm trying to process what he's saying. And I'm like, whoa, this is heavy, but I got to ask the next question. And this one was hitting me because I feel like I'm so passionate about you finding your why, right? Which is your personal application of who God's created you to be, because you are created on purpose and for a purpose. And it goes down from the macro down to the micro. It really does, right? He's created you uniquely to do good works, which God has prepared in advance for you to do. That's why I created Spiritual DNA, spiritualdna.me, where you can start your journey. But if it's not actually rooted in the macro purposes of God, we'll find ourselves down some self-seeking, selfish, self-destructive pathway. And I don't want you to be there. Or you may never find it because you don't believe enough in who God's created you to be to step into it. And so the process is we've got to start with what Mike talks about there, which is the macro purposes of God for humanity, which is our what. That's what we do. Right? That's where I want you to start to understand that your macro purpose is what you do. And what Mike unpacks there is we worship God. We're created in his image to worship him. We're created by God to live in community, right? Jesus says, what's the most important commandments? Love your Lord your God with all your heart, soul, mind, and strength, and love your neighbor as yourself. It's impossible to love your neighbor as yourself if you're not living in community with other people because you don't have any neighbors, okay? So we worship God. We live in community. As Mike says, we become a conduit of God's blessing to others. Those are the macro purposes of God. So guess what? I don't care where you live or how old you are, how young you are, or whatever it is. Your purpose of life are found in those macro purposes of God. And so right now, if you're struggling to find your micro purpose, double down on those macro purposes. And guess how you find those macro purposes of God? You live in his presence and you pursue his peace. You see, it builds on the first 2 points. As you abide in the presence of Jesus, he begins to change your soul. He begins to transform you by the renewing of your mind. He begins to give you the desires of your heart because your heart begins to beat in line and in rhythm with his and the macro purposes of God. Now, the micro part, the micro is how you do it. The micro is how you do it. And that's what we try to help you uncover here. But if it's not founded, if it's not rooted in those macro purposes of God, I'm afraid it's going to send you down a path that's not going to lead to his presence. It's not going to lead to peace. And it may lead to burnout and possibly sabotaging your life. And I don't want that for you. Start with the macro, right? Start with the macro and let the big picture create the little picture of your life. And as Mike said there, don't reduce your life down to just your purpose. Expand your understanding of your purpose to be first and foremost found in the presence of God in his macro purposes, that you worship God. You're created in his image to worship him, to be in life with him, to enjoy his presence, that you're created to love other people, to actually be in community with people, and then join together with those people and bring and the conduit of God's blessing for what it means to live in a covenant relationship with him to everyone that you're around. And the great part is that there's a unique way that you do that, your micro purpose. But get it in the right order, and you'll be amazed what flows from it. Hey, guys. I love it. One of my favorite parts of the week is getting to stand here, and record this podcast with you, for you, and would love to hear back from you. Take some time this week. Think about your motivation. What's your payoff you're looking for? I want to encourage you to find it in his presence, in his peace, and in his macro purpose for all of humanity. And you get those in the right order. You get those in the right momentum, and you will be amazed at what it feels like and the impact that your micro purpose has in following him. All right, friends. Until next week, never forget these three things. God is for you, not against you. He's near you, not far from you. And he's created you on purpose and for a purpose. God bless. Have a great week. Thanks for listening to this episode of the Daron Earlewine Podcast.